All right, all right. Turn to someone and say, God math. We are going to finish up that series this morning. Now, I have learned that many people will actually measure their life by what's missing. How many know that God measures by what is left? So a lot of us, we have a tendency to look at our lives and see what we've lost, like what we don't have, what hasn't worked out, what walked out, what ran out, what dried up. And we're quick to measure even our futures by what is missing, not by what we have. And it is in what you have is the miracle of God's provision for your life. So turn to someone and say, I got to have. In other words, stop looking at what is missing, stop looking at what you've lost, and begin to start looking on what you still have in your life. And it's with what you have, God's provision will begin to take place and take over for what we have lost. There's an interesting story in 2 Kings chapter 4 that really just kind of describes what I want to talk to you a little bit about today, and that is simply this. Listen, when we come to God, when we trust and obey Him with what we've got, He will begin to provide not just all we need, but He actually begins to provide even more than what we need. So you find in this story in 2 Kings, you've got a widow who thought she had lost like everything, like she didn't have much left. She had lost her husband. Her sons were in danger of being lost to slavery. Now, it wasn't like slavery here. In other words, they were going to have to go serve someone else to pay their debts off because the man of the house was dead and there was no longer any income coming in. In other words, her hope was running on empty. Her whole life was being squeezed by a crisis that she couldn't control. And all this lady had was just a small little flask of oil. Just a little bit, just a very small amount. Now, that may not seem much to us, like you probably got vegetable oil in the pantry, yeah? Okay, maybe you're cooking with olive oil. Crisco? All right, you've got something in there, right? I hope you're not just throwing it in the pan and burning the house down. Like this oil, we must understand that it wasn't just about cooking for them. In fact, in their culture, oil was actually very valuable. It wasn't just a random household item that they had in the house, but it was actually something far more valuable than that. It wasn't just like something you hid in the back of the pantry and took out when you cooked, but it was actually what I would say was liquid currency. This oil was liquid currency, and it had several different purposes when it came to this oil. In fact, they would use the oil to light their lamps. How many know they didn't just go over to the wall and flip the switch and then there was light? Like they had the oil that they put in the lamp, and then they had to let that burn, baby, and if it ran out, then they had to add more, and so they used it for light. They also used this oil for medicine back in those days. They would pour it on to heal wounds. They would trade it for income. They would trade it and barter and sell it for different things. In fact, ladies, they even used it for cosmetic uses. Doesn't that sound good? Just rubbing the oil all over your face. Maybe you use foundation, maybe you use all different things, but they didn't have those kind of things. They would just use this oil to kind of help their skin and the grooming. It also was used for ceremonial uses, worship, purification, consecration, and yes, the oil was actually used for food preservation and cooking. So, when this lady said, all I have is just a little oil, she's not saying I've got some vegetable oil in the pantry and that's it. She's actually saying this little value that I have left is the only possible providing of income for me, the only thing that I could actually sell, the only thing that represents any future. And listen, it is barely a drop. Let's read it, 2 Kings chapter 4. One day the widow of a member of the group of prophets came to Elisha and cried out, my husband who served you is dead, and you know how he feared the Lord. But now a creditor has come, threatening to take my 2 sons as slaves. What can I do to help you? Elijah asked. Tell me, what do you have in the house? And here's where she says it, nothing at all except a flask of olive oil, she replied. Like, have you ever been down to your last little bit of toothpaste? Think about this for a moment. If you're like me, you probably take that bad boy, instead of going to buy one, you roll it up, you squeeze it real hard, you do all these different tricks, that are humanly possible, and just somehow, if you could just get just a little bit out, oh, you're in business and ready to brush your teeth. Anybody as frugal as me? Like you just, oh, it's not time yet. We still got a little bit more in there. And that's how this widow felt. Like she's down to the last squeeze, if you will, of her life. Now, if that wasn't enough, that she was just down to her little squeeze, she thought it was just a little. She thought it was all that she had. But listen, with God, it's never just a little. It's way more than enough. With God, He can do a lot, and He is about ready to show her that when we say all we have is a little bit left, God says, hey, that is all I need. Just give me the little bit. Just let it go and see what might happen. Now, the provision isn't just in the little. In fact, it really has nothing to do with how much she has. It actually has everything to do with that she was willing to trust and obey God. The provision that she needed was actually in her trusting and obeying what was getting ready to take place. And how many know that it is the same with us? God's provision comes when we trust and obey. How many know that to be true? When we trust and we obey, things begin to take place. And I don't know if you've ever experienced this in your life, but many a times, what God asks us to do does not make sense. Have you ever been in that moment where you're needing provision from God, and all of a sudden the instructions come, and it makes no logical sense? It does not feel logical. Like it feels a little out of the ordinary. It just does not make sense to our natural minds. Let me give you a case in point. Let's read on 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 3. He said, and Elisha said, borrow as many empty jars as you can from your friends and your neighbors. Then go into your house with your sons and shut the door behind you. Pour olive oil from your flask into the jars, setting each one aside when it is filled. I don't know about you, but that sounds a bit crazy to me. Like, It wasn't that God said, hey, go to your neighbors and grab some full jars of oil. No, what he said was, hey, go to your neighbors and collect empty jars. Not just one jar, get as many jars as you possibly can. Now imagine this, if you would. Anybody, let me just ask this first. Anybody ever do door-to-door sales? I'm the only one. All right. For a while there, well, not for a very long while, just a short period of time, I did some door knocking to try to sell Kirby vacuum cleaners. Anybody, let me ask this. Anybody ever have somebody come knocking on your door trying to sell you a Kirby vacuum cleaner? All right, there's a few of us. And so we would walk around, or we're knocking on the doors, and this was kind of our spiel. It was, now looking back, it was pretty shady. It was pretty shady. In fact, it was a pretty shady part of my life. And so we would knock on the door and say, hey, we're here to let you know that you've been selected to enter into a shopping spree for $1,000. How many know that that sounds pretty good? And so if they were willing to give you their name, you'd write their name and their address down, their phone number, and you would just do that for all day long. And then the next day, the lucky winner, I don't know, they look like they had money. You'd pick somebody, call them up and say, hey, we want to let you know that you have won $1,000 complimentary to go out and grocery shop, and it's your lucky day. We also are going to include a demonstration of a vacuum cleaner and help you clean your floors like you've never seen before. How's that sound to you? Oh, yeah, great. Set up the appointment, and you'd go, and the whole purpose was to sell the vacuum cleaner. So how many know that the Kirby vacuum cleaner, it ain't like going to Walmart and getting one for $50 to $90. Like, it's several thousands of dollars, and you do your demo and all that good stuff. Well, anyways, imagine, if you will, you're not there to sell anything, but she's there knocking on the door saying, hey, can I borrow some jars? Huh? You want to borrow jars? Yeah. Why? What? Because, you know, they know that this lady has lost everything. They know what's going on in her life. Well, you know, I'm going to do a project. Oh, really? What kind of project? Well, you know, it's just a project that has to do with some jars. Can I borrow your jars? And so they're going around door to door asking for every jar that they possibly can find. And I just got to say, I don't know if I would have been as trusting and as obedient as this lady and her sons, because to me, going and walking and knocking is very humbling. Like when you got to borrow something from your neighbor, it just kind of puts you in a whole different perspective of humility, because you've got to ask for help. And so there she is knocking, and she's collecting all these empty jars. But here is the thing. Even though it may not seem like it was very logical, even though it doesn't seem like God even knows what he's doing to grab all these empty jars, she does one thing. She trusts and she obeys. Even though it doesn't feel logical. And how many know, but when you trust and you obey, it actually will lead to overflow. When we trust and obey, we lead ourselves to overflow. Let me give you a point in case. Luke chapter 5, the guys are out there. Jesus has just got done speaking to these major crowds, and he gets in the boat to do this with Simon and all of his little buddies there. And after he gets done, he says something to them. He says, hey, Simon, go out to where it's a little deeper and let down your nets to catch some fish. Now, these guys repeat something that they already knew, but they repeat it for Jesus' sake and say, hey, Jesus, come on now. We've been out all night. We've already been out there. We've been fishing and fishing and fishing, and nothing took place. Like we didn't catch anything. But then they say something very important. They say something that leads to the overflow. They say, because you asked us, we'll go out and do that. Luke chapter 5, verse 6 says this, and at this time, their nets were so full of fish, they began to tear. Now, if you've ever been fishing, that's a whole lot of fish. I get picture it for a moment. They fished with nets, so it wasn't like us throwing out our little hook and hopefully catching one or two, but it was actually this net that they would pour out over the boat, and they caught so many fish that the nets are about to tear, and all of a sudden they're yelling out, hey, we need some help over here. And so their partners come, they bring another boat, and listen, and soon both boats were filled with fish and on the verge of sinking. I don't know about you, but that sounds like overflow to me. Picture it for a moment. You've just gone fishing all night. Jesus asks you to do something that seems so illogical, so just, I don't know, Jesus, we've been doing it all night. This hole is already dried up. There are no fish in this part of the sea, but yet because you asked, because you said, hey, go out, try it again, they trust, they obey, and overflow comes. Listen, God will multiply when we trust and we obey. And it doesn't have to make sense to us. We don't even have to understand what God is even asking us to do. In fact, Proverbs 3, chapter 3, verse 5 says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean what? Don't depend on your own understanding. See, I think a lot of times we miss opportunities for God to come through with provision because we're trying to make sense of it all. We're trying to understand it right up here. We're trying to get to the place where, okay, one plus one is 2, but God is saying, as we've discovered, 5 plus 2 is actually way more in his economy. This idea of provision cannot come from our own understanding. In fact, it's got to be where we trust the Lord with all of our heart, and not to lean on what we can understand. In fact, I've found many a times when miracles are taking place and God's provision is happening or healing's taking place or whatever the case, right? The supernatural things of the Lord, they do not happen without somebody's got to step out in the natural. That's why it's called supernatural. And so we've got to trust God. And here this widow is, faced with the same decision. But verse 5 says, so she did as she was told. Her sons kept bringing jars to her, and she filled one after another. Soon, every container was full to the brim. Could you imagine that for a moment? Like you've got this little flask of, just this little jar of oil. You've got all these other jars, and all you've got to do is, I'm just picturing and going, man, you mean this little small jar is going to fill up this jar, and then the next jar, and then the next jar? If she would have stayed right here and went, that don't make no sense, nothing would have happened. It was only when she trusted and obeyed and started to pour out. Listen, she had to pour out what she had. She could not keep what she had to get the blessing. She had to pour out what she had, and at every moment she kept pouring, it filled to the brim. And then she probably took that little thing and went there. And this is just me. I'm looking at the story going, I'd probably be looking in that jar going, I don't understand how this is happening, but this is pretty cool. Like, I just keep pouring, and it just keeps filling, and it just never goes away. I mean, put yourself there. Could you imagine? I don't know. That sounds like a pretty awesome way to experience God's provision, that he just took the little she had and she said, all right, God, I'm going to trust you. I'm going to obey you. I'm going to go gather up as many empty jars as we can, and then we're just going to start pouring, and we're just going to see what happens. How many knows sometimes you just got to see what happens? Too many times, though, we're asking the wrong question. We're going, well, what if it doesn't work? Change your mindset and start asking, what if it does? What if I trust God? What if I'm obedient towards what God is asking me to do? What if it actually works? What if he actually comes through with the provision that he has already prepared for us? But we've got to trust and obey. And then God's math begins to take over. Then she gets to this moment where she says to one of her sons, hey, bring me another jar, she said to one of her sons. And how many know that this was not a good moment probably for her? Like, there are not any more jars. Like, there's nothing left. Because here's what happened when there was no more jars. The olive oil stopped flowing. Not because God ran out, but because she ran out of places to receive that provision. And when I read that, I think to myself, man, maybe she should have sent them like to the next town. Like, maybe they shouldn't have just stopped in their own village of knocking on doors. Maybe they should have went to the next town and maybe another town, or those people way out in the outskirts, and knocked and said, hey, do you have any jars? Because God's blessing would have just kept on going as long as she had a place to receive. Listen, it's not because God runs out. It's because sometimes we run out of expectation. And then things stop. I think if she would have had more jars, they would have just kept filling them up. They would have just kept filling them up and filling them up. And here's the really cool thing. At the end of this story, in verse 7, she begins to tell the man of God. When she told the man of God what happened, he said to her, now sell the olive oil and pay your debts. In other words, God had provision for her debt. And then he goes on to say, and you and your sons can live on what is left over. In other words, the little just didn't turn into enough. It was more than enough. God didn't just give her a little bit to scrape by. He didn't just give her a little to pay off her debt. No, actually, God gave her a business, a revenue stream, and a future, because now that little flask of oil became many, many jars that she could buy, sell, trade. Income was going to flow. Her future had a hope. And it was all because, listen, she didn't keep the little oil. She trusted and obeyed God. And as long as she kept moving and kept pouring, God kept multiplying. It kind of reminds me of last week, right? When we tithe, when we test God in our finances and we give that 10%, what does he say? He doesn't just say he's going to pour out a little. No, he actually said, I will pour out more than you can even handle. Or how about this very place that we started, this God math? Oh, they had 5 loaves and 2 little fish. that's all they had, just a little. But then God took that little and fed thousands. And the great thing, I love how that story ends, because it not only said that they fed the thousands, which we know, yes, it says 5,000. Scholars believe, theologians believe, that at least there was probably, every man was represented by one or two kids, so it was really more like 20 to 25,000 people that actually they fed, and then there was leftovers. They picked up a bunch more. Because God doesn't just provide enough. He provides an abundant provision for you and I. Listen, this math doesn't make sense. In fact, I don't think regular math makes sense a lot of times, especially when you get into that calculus stuff and all those other things. It just doesn't make sense to me. But God's math really doesn't make sense. But He's only asking for one thing, just trusting Him, obeying Him, using what we have, just a little bit. And if we will trust Him, He will multiply it. When we're even at our last moment, our last drop, just like this lady was, and not much of a future, listen, He still was able to provide more than enough. It's even like that with our own lives, isn't it? I'm just one man living on the earth. In the midst of 8 billion people. There's little old me. But there was a point in time where God came and said, hey, if you'll give me your life, oh man, I'll change everything. Imagine that. Imagine what He can do with a life completely surrendered to Him. When you place yourself in His hands. Listen, some of us may feel like that widow this morning. You're down to not much hope. You're at your last moment. You're given up with only a little bit of strength. It might be your last chance. But listen, every person that comes to the Lord, He begins to feel like one of those jars. Every person that will say, hey, God, I give you my life, He will fill every empty part of your heart. Most of you already know a little bit about my story, but listen, I was completely empty. I was down in my mind to my last hope, to my last chance. In fact, when I was sitting in that jail cell, that was the very word that I heard from the Lord. It didn't make sense at the time. He said, Joe, this is your last chance. Get it right. Now, it wasn't audible, but it was pretty darn close. It got my attention, and I said, whoa. Something's got to change here. I had tried everything else the world had to offer. I had tried drugs. I had tried women. I had tried all the different things. The only thing I didn't try was fame and fortune. Still waiting for that one. But how many know the famous and the fortunate? Well, they switch spouses like I do underwear. Right? They're not happy. Listen, the fame and the fortune isn't making them happy either, because they're still searching. Listen, every heart on the face of the planet is empty without God living inside. Every single one of us. And when we come to Him, just like this widow, and say, God, this is all I got. Just me. Can't offer you anything else. And the great thing is God doesn't want anything else. In fact, we can't give him anything else. We can't pay for it. We can't earn it. All we can do is surrender the empty jar to him and say, God, here is my life. Do what you can. And oh, what a great thing that he will do as we pour out our lives for him. He just continues to fill us up and multiply the oil. And listen, it's not really about money, but I got to say that probably the greatest multiplying that we could ever have on the face of the earth is when I place my life in his hands and he says, I will transform that life. I will make that life full of purpose. I will make that life full of a great future. I will make that a life that will experience the abundance of me, because he said in John chapter 10, I came to give life and life more abundantly. Listen, God is not looking for us to scrape by on this earth. He's not just looking for us to have just a little bit. No, he wants for our whole lives to transform. And here's the key. It's only in that moment that we actually say yes to Jesus. Does he begin to pour the oil, which really represents the Holy Spirit of God, coming into our lives as a seal, as a guarantee that we're going to live. And we're going to live forever. Amen.